Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to this session on identifying key biodiversity areas based on Criterion C, which is ecological integrity. But before we begin, let's go over a bit of housekeeping. So this session is expected to be around 60 to 75 minutes. And it is being recorded. So I think I've turned all your videos off automatically, but so please feel free to keep it like this and keep your cameras turned off. I will be turning my camera off after we've gone through the learning objectives so that everyone can see the entire screen. And yeah, so this session has also been divided into 3 different sections. So if you have any questions, please ask them at the end of each of the sections or at the end of the session. This is mostly just so that if we do decide to share this recording more widely, the core content will not be disturbed by some questions in the middle. So related to that, if you do have questions, please either type them into the chat, and if you do that, you can send it at any time, or simply raise your hand using the reactions box. At the end of each of the 3 sections, I will be going into the chat to see what questions are there. And I'll also be looking out to see if anyone has raised their hand. If you've raised your hand, obviously I will call on you. Having said that, I have allocated only about 5 minutes at the end of each section. So if it seems like we're going to be going beyond the 5 minutes with Q&A, then I think I'll probably put the questions on hold at that moment. Continue with the rest of the, or continue with the next section, and then answer all the remaining questions just at the very end. Again, this is just to make sure that everyone who has registered for this session is able to at least watch me deliver the core content. And then if they have to leave, then at least they won't have missed anything. So I think that's basically it in terms of housekeeping. So let's get started with the session and the learning objectives. So the overarching learning goal of today's session is for you to learn the concept of ecological integrity as it is being used by the KBA Secretariat, and to apply Criterion C when identifying key biodiversity areas. That overarching learning goal has been divided into these 4 learning objectives. So by the end of the session, you should be able to explain the 3 main concepts that are listed here: ecological integrity, intact ecological communities, and industrial human impact. Outline the relationship between ecological integrity, ecosystem structure, function, and composition, and the indicators associated to these components of ecosystem. You'll also be able to create a concept map for a site using relevant indicators that illustrate the ecosystem structure, function, composition, and finally, explain the importance of Indigenous and local knowledge in assessing and evaluating ecological integrity. So, as I mentioned, I am gonna turn my video off now so you can see the entire screen for the rest of the session. So, Criterion C sites are sites which have outstanding ecological integrity at the global scale. This means that these sites are characterized by having intact ecological communities and by basically being undisturbed by industrial human influence. So there are three key phrases that I would like to bring your attention to: ecological integrity, intact ecological communities, and industrial human influence. In the next 3 slides, we'll be going over these 3 terms before, we'll be going over these 3 terms to really understand what we mean by ecological integrity. So intact ecological community is basically just one that is able to maintain its full complement of species in their natural abundances or biomass that are expected or known to occur at the site. In general, the reference point of the ecological community for a site or for the ecosystem, for the ecoregion, will be before the Industrial Revolution. In terms of industrial human influence, we're basically talking about human activities that have historically resulted in overexploitation or overharvesting of resources in the area. So note the use of the word industrial in the phrase. This definition allows for, and in fact accepts, indigenous practices at historic levels of extraction, but not allow for unsustainable practices or unsustainable levels of extraction. So when we talk about the absence of or minimal human impact, basically we're referring to the lack of exploitative activities that tend to take place at an industrial level. So the KBA Secretariat uses IUCN's definition of ecological integrity by putting the 2 definitions that we just went over together. So ecological integrity is referring to a condition that supports intact species assemblages and ecological processes in their natural state relative to an appropriate historical benchmark and characterized by a contiguous natural habitat with minimal direct industrial anthropogenic disturbance. So intact species assemblages is referring to the idea that the species is able to or has maintained its complement of species in their natural abundances. The supports ecological processes in its natural state is referring to biological patterns and ecological processes that are able to take place at the landscape level without significant human interference. And finally, the natural habitat that has experienced little direct industrial disturbance from humans is referring to the fact that these sites would have to be relatively free from large-scale human-caused disturbance. And this is in terms of like industrial agriculture. It can be in terms of timber harvesting or invasive species. So the unit of analysis for Criterion C sites are ecoregions, because the site has to be up to 2 sites per ecoregion that is characterized with wholly intact ecological communities. And this is generally in terms of the composition and abundance of species and their interactions. So since a vital component of this criteria is having been essentially undisturbed by large-scale industrial human influence, ecoregions that have undergone massive changes during and after the Industrial Revolution may not have any sites that could actually qualify or qualify to be a Criterion C site. So with that criterion and assessment parameter in mind, let's revisit the definition of ecological integrity with a view of how do you actually measure it. Well, what exactly does supporting intact species assemblages and ecological processes in their natural state, with minimal direct industrial impact actually mean? And how do we actually go about measuring ecological integrity? Well, in 2021, there was a workshop in which the KBA Standards and Appeals Committee came up with a broader operational definition of ecological integrity. So for the purposes of applying KBA Criterion C, the operational definition is the degree to which an ecosystem's observed structure, function, and composition resemble those characteristic of regionally appropriate historical benchmarks or other high-integrity reference states that support ecosystem and biodiversity persistence and are minimally impaired by threatening processes. So as you can see, this definition accepts that the composition of natural ecosystems can actually be dynamic over space and time. And the use of the word degree in the definition is referring to the fact that ecological integrity of any area can fall along a spectrum of sites having outstanding ecological integrity, all the way to sites whose ecological integrity may have collapsed. So another way of looking at this definition, another way of looking at this definition could basically be along the lines of, to apply Criterion C to a site, we first need to find appropriate high integrity reference dates, and find as in identify, and this could be potentially historical benchmarks that can help determine the composition, structure, and function of a site with outstanding ecological integrity for that ecoregion, and then compare the values of those three components, the ecosystem composition, structure, and function, to the values of a prospective Criterion C site. So the keywords in this definition have been underlined in green, and these are structure, function, composition, and high integrity reference dates. Over the next 10 to 12 slides, I'll basically be going over these key words, and after exploring these concepts, we'll go over the overview of the entire process and show how everything fits together. But for now, let's start with high integrity reference states. High integrity reference states are used to identify attributes and indicators of ecosystem structure, function, and composition, and to understand what the acceptable range of values for the identified indicators for that ecoregion and ecosystem are. This means that you can kind of think of high integrity reference states as the baseline or the baseline range. So in other words, you can use high integrity reference states to identify the range of acceptable variation in the values of composition, structure, and function of the ecoregion. And there are multiple ways in which values for high integrity reference states can be derived. Today, we'll be going over 4 categories: historical benchmarks, reference sites, ecosystem modeling, and finally, expert judgment. So in terms of historical benchmarks or baselines, you can use these to identify the initial state of the ecoregion or the site in the ecoregion, and then assess or change or compare the change in the site over specified timeframes. If you use historical benchmarks, you will need to include an explanation of why the historical benchmark is appropriate to the region. You can also use reference sites, and these refer to sites that may have been replicated more recently to highlight ecosystems that face minimal threatening processes or drivers. So these sites would basically lack the threatening processes, such as mining, large-scale fishing, and implementation of methods of fire suppression, or just industrial agriculture as well. You can also create ecosystem models to highlight the expected range of values of indicators of the ecosystem or ecoregion. And you can do this by creating models of ecosystem features and processes, or use characteristic biological patterns, and or use long-term data sets about the indicators of composition, structure, and function of the ecoregion. If there isn't sufficient information in published papers, or there isn't sufficient data that you could use, you can also turn to expert judgments. And expert judgments could be the forms of members of the scientific community and or indigenous and local communities and their knowledge about the site. And you can do this specifically to fill in the gaps in knowledge. So yeah, you can use either scientific judgments. Well, not either. You can use both scientific judgments and or indigenous and local knowledge to verify what high integrity reference states might look like for that ecoregion, for that area, for that site. I would like to stress here that you don't have to use all of these methods that I just talked about. You can be flexible about which method you use for the different indicators. So now let's go over the other three terms of ecological integrity. So ecological integrity is broken down into three components: composition, structure, and function. In the next few slides, we'll briefly go over the definition of each, some key considerations that may help you select indicators for the ecoregions, and examples of some indicators. And keep in mind that the examples are just examples. You do not have to use the same attributes and or indicators in your Criterion C application, obviously. So to determine the composition component of Criterion C site, you will first need to identify species that represent the key characteristics of the ecoregion. And you can select them as indicators of composition. You can also assess species richness, relative abundance or cover, diversity, biomass across taxonomic groups, and trophic levels, as mentioned on the slide. Some key points that you may want to consider could be whether the biological communities are made up of a mixture of different ages and spacing that supports the natural native biodiversity, and whether any key native species have been lost from the system whether the species has instead gained some non-native species. So, for example, are there any alien invasive species present at the site? And if yes, how have these invasives altered the ecological processes, interactions, and functions of the ecosystem? So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, some examples of some indicators under composition could be some key native species and evidence that they are found at functional densities at the site, and the species richness of the area or of the site. In terms of structure of the ecoregion or ecosystem, we need to think about how the area is actually organized physically. So this will include characteristics such as connectivity, fragmentation, and how the organisms have been distributed within the space, both horizontally and also vertically. So some of the key points that you may want to consider related to physical arrangement of this space could be whether area demanding species are actually able to disperse across the landscape to the different resource patches that may be in different areas, whether the patch size and isolation affect the key species in the ecoregion, and whether the trophic structure has been altered or simplified, again, for example, by the presence of an alien invasive species. So related to those questions, as I mentioned earlier, a possible attribute to measure the structure of the site could be related to habitat, or could be habitat connectivity. And then the indicators of habitat connectivity could be the presence of area demanding species and or just satellite imagery of the forest cover as well. And finally, the third component, function, includes the ecological and ecosystem processes. So examples of these processes are predator-prey interactions, hydrological processes, and the species metapopulation dynamics, and so on. So again, the key considerations that you may want to consider are whether these natural processes that support the native biodiversity occur at historic levels, and whether the population density of indicator species are high enough to continue playing their functional role. So, for example, based on the previous slide, some of the key indicators could be evidence related to or long-term data showing the natural disturbance regime patterns of the site and the population or densities of functional indicator species. So for this, for example, you could also provide long-term population data of predator and prey species to show that they are fulfilling their functional roles. So keeping in mind the three components of ecological integrity and indicators, let's review how ecological integrity of a site could be measured. So on this slide, you can see that we need two different or two types of information evidence. So the first is the measures of composition, structure, and function of the ecoregion. So this is in terms of what we just talked about, the species composition and abundance, forest cover, biomass, and so on and so forth. The second is the measures of absence or very low levels of direct industrial human impact. Again, I want to stress that absence off or very low levels of direct industrial human impact does not necessarily imply absence or even low densities of human inhabitants. Instead, it's actually talking about the fact that, or the idea that human impact must not have eroded the ecological integrity of the site. So we went over the measures of structure, function, and composition of the ecoregion, but I will go over the measures of absence of direct industrial human impact in the next section. Yeah, so basically, this is the end of the first part of the webinar, which just focused on the ecosystem components and the high integrity reference dates. And yeah, this is the end of the first third. So we have 2 more sections before the session is over. All right, so now we're gonna start putting everything together and actually talk about the process of identifying Criterion C KBAs. So when you start the process of identifying Criterion C KBAs, there are 3 main steps. So the first one is regional scoping analysis. The second step is site evaluation, and the last step is site selection. So let's go over each of these in a bit more detail. So in the regional scoping analysis stage, you will first need to identify ecoregions that have high potential of having a site with high ecological integrity. Once you've identified the ecoregions with high potential, you will need to identify relevant attributes and indicators at the species and non-species level for the ecoregion. So for example, here are some species level indicators for the 3 components of ecological integrity. So to show high integrity in terms of composition, you can identify species that are sensitive to human impact or human activities. And then basically just measure their population size. To show structural integrity of the site, you can measure the population densities or distribution of the top predators or other area demanding species. And then in terms of function, you can identify species that play a key functional role, for example, disperser or seed disperser or a pollinator, or a species that depends on broad-scale ecological processes, such as annual floods, annual fires, and so on. And then basically, yeah, provide their population data to show that their population is large enough to fulfill their functional role in the ecosystem. Finally, you can also identify species that indicate just general ecological condition. So species that indicate air or water quality and show that these species are, species that are present only in high integrity sites. And then in terms of indicators at the non-species level, again, for composition, you can measure species diversity. You can show the trophic levels that are still present at the site and then compare it to one at a high integrity reference state site. To demonstrate structural integrity, you can use remote sensing to calculate the forest cover and or habitat connectivity, or you can use movement patterns of GPS tagged individuals, especially like, again, the area demanding species. And then finally, for function, you could demonstrate or compare the primary productivity of the site that you're proposing to the primary productivity of a high integrity reference state in the ecoregion. So basically, there are a lot of options. So yeah, so this is why it is critical that you spend a lot of time in the beginning identifying measurable relevant indicators. So those were examples. Now let's get back to the steps. So once you've identified the attributes and indicators for the ecoregion, you can also identify the pressures that are likely to alter the composition, structure, and or function of the ecoregion. At this point, I would like to stress that when we say measures or measure pressures likely to affect the site, we mean that you will need to assess what the key drivers of change within that ecosystem are. And then once you've identified the key drivers of change, you will need to reflect on the impact that that particular driver of change is having at the site, and then identify indicators that have a large impact. So, for example, in two different sites, roads could have two very different effects. So in site one, roads could lead to reducing large mammal densities because of hunting. In site two, roads could lead to reduced tree cover due to increase in logging. So in site one, the appropriate indicator would be to measure or monitor the large mammal population size. But for the second site, the appropriate indicator would be satellite images showing the forest cover of the site. So basically what I was trying to say with those examples, or that example, is that the indicators that you select need to reflect the pressures or impact on the site, and not just the presence of activity or artifact. And again, I would like to stress that as long as the existing human activity or activities are sustainable and is not negatively affecting the ecological integrity of the site, the activity would not be considered a pressure. But if it is negatively affecting the ecological integrity of the site, then obviously that is having a clear impact and it is a pressure. So after you've identified the relevant attributes and indicators of ecological integrity and the indicators of pressures at the site, you may need to develop a concept map that illustrates the relationships or these relationships between the various attributes and indicators. In a way, this is kind of considered optional, but it is highly recommended because it would help you keep track of the indicators that you have either provided information on or that you will need to provide information on. And at the same time, when you submit the proposal to the Secretariat or to the RFP and then the Secretariat, it can also help the reviewers understand the key relationships at the site. So, for instance, in this simplified example concept map of the composition, structure, and function for Nuabali Ndoki site in the Congo Basin, you can see the composition, structure, and function components of the ecosystem. So in the green hexagons, you can see the composition components. The blue rounded rectangular boxes show indicators related to structure. the yellow ovals show attributes and indicators related to function, and the red straight-edged boxes show the existing threats in the ecoregion or the pressures. So some of these elements can be selected as indicators and measured to demonstrate the overall ecological integrity of the site. So basically, based on this concept map, we could identify elephants, gorilla, and this plant species. I'm probably not going to pronounce it properly, but G. dewervi as indicator species. We could also use satellite imagery of the forest cover as another indicator, and then also assess the impact of these three drivers of change, labeled here as threats, to determine whether these human influences have had a significant impact on the ecological integrity of the site or not. And again, remember, pressure or presence does not equal pressure or impact. Just as an example, as shown, as you can see in this concept map, roads can affect habitat connectivity. Deforestation can change the forest cover, and hunting can directly reduce elephant population size. So to demonstrate minimal human impact in this potential case, you may have to provide some evidence showing that the habitat is still well connected. So there is low or no isolation of patches within the site due to the presence of roads. You may also have to show that the forest cover hasn't changed much over the past few decades. So here you could potentially use satellite imagery, the earliest satellite imagery that you have access to, and current satellite imagery to show that the forest cover hasn't changed all that much within, the last 50 decades, or sorry, not 50 decades, 50 years or something along that line. And then again, in terms of the elephants, using elephants as the indicators, again, if you have long-term data sets of elephant population census, then you could also use that to demonstrate that although hunting does happen, it is not at an industrial scale, or it's not, it is a concern, but it's not actually threatening the integrity of the site. And then, so after you've created the concept map with the relevant attributes, pressures, and the related indicators of both, you will need to set thresholds for the indicators based on high integrity reference sites that we went over earlier in the session. And then after setting the thresholds for the indicators, you'll need to delineate the preliminary site boundary. And that basically is the end of the regional scoping analysis step. After that, we'll go into site evaluation. But actually, I just realized we do have we have one slide on how to actually delineate a site boundary. So ideally, Criterion C sites are recommended to be at least 10,000 kilometers square in size. But we do understand that this may not always be feasible, and sometimes it's not even necessary. So in the case of isolated islands or, in the case of isolated islands, this wouldn't even be necessary. So the key thing here is that the size of the proposed site needs to be sufficient to sustain natural movement patterns of the native species and accommodate natural ecological processes of the ecoregion. Ideally, the site should be large enough that it can maintain its ecological processes, and or if there is a disturbance, that it can recover its ecological process after the disturbance without large-scale human interference. So again, historical indigenous management practices and minimal human interventions are acceptable, but large-scale interventions would indicate that the site does not actually have high level of ecological integrity. So when a site does require large-scale interventions, it probably won't fulfill the criteria of being a Criterion C site. And finally, the sites that have outstanding ecological integrity may not necessarily fit within the boundaries of ecoregions. So if there are cases, when there are cases that the Criterion C KBA that you are proposing includes more than one ecoregion within the site, then you as the proposer will need to specify which ecoregion the site is representing. And then once you have roughly delineated the site, you can begin to evaluate the site or sites that you have delineated. So to validate the evidence and confirm that the site indicator values are within the thresholds based on the high integrity reference dates, you may have to host workshops with relevant knowledge holders, land rights holders, and experts. So, for instance, some sites that qualify as Criterion C sites might actually be within indigenous territories and may include long-established local communities. And again, just as a reminder, human presence within a Criterion C site is acceptable as long as the human impact on the site is not of industrial proportions and is sustainable. So, for instance, indigenous hunting practices taking place within the site at historically sustainable levels are acceptable, but modern hunting practices that have a tendency of overexploiting or overharvesting any species would not be acceptable or would be seen as an issue. Also, as I mentioned in the previous slide, indigenous and local knowledge can play an important role when evaluating and delineating sites, because they may be able to verify some information related to the indicators that you have selected, and they might also be able to help determine manageable boundaries for the Criterion C site. Next, you may be using information from remotely sensed data sets and other data sources. You will need to verify the information that you are providing. So this may also be done in workshops with relevant knowledge holders and experts by reviewing the existing data or by collecting new data, especially for information that cannot be inferred from remotely sensed data. So this would be in terms of some of the examples that are on the slide: overexploitation of biological resources, water quality, air quality, and disease outbreaks, and so on. And then for the last step, finally, after having evaluated the delineated site, you may need to refine the boundaries of the prospective sites. We highly recommend including indigenous and local knowledge holders during this process as well, so that there is high level of buy-in from the ground. And if there are more than 2 sites with outstanding ecological integrity in the ecoregion, then there is an extra step. So you will need to rank the sites based on the information that you were able to collect, and then identify the best 2 sites or the 2 best sites, and potentially propose the 2 best sites. So before ending this session, this part of the session, I would like to stress that no one can measure everything, obviously. So when you are compiling data, please keep in mind that the most important aspect is to compile data that justifies low human impact and high ecological integrity, and then present that information in the proposal. So with that in mind, the 3 parts of the process that I would like to emphasize are identifying the relevant indicators, measuring those indicators, and involving Indigenous communities whenever possible and relevant. And that is basically it in terms of the process of identifying Criterion C KBAs. So in the next section, we will be going over how to propose Criterion C sites in the WDKBA. I'm gonna treat this, so basically this is the little break. I did notice that there are a couple of questions. There is a question from Renaud. I'm not actually sure about this. I don't think, Renaud's question is the ecoregion and bioregion map update complete yet? I don't think so, but Andy, you might have more.
All the ecoregion maps are there. We're using the 2017 terrestrial ecoregion of Olsen et al. We're using the freshwater ecoregions that TNC developed, and we're using the marine ecoregions that TNC developed. And then for bioregions, we've used the pelagic provinces for marine. That there's a freshwater bioregion map the TNC developed, and we're nearly there with the terrestrial bioregion map. We're just waiting for input from Australia.
Okay.
Maybe Kendall, you can help with that.
Okay.
I need to lean on the Australians to get going.
I don't see those questions from. Is there? I can only see one set of questions. Meeting chat.
Oh, I think you sent it directly to me. Sorry.
Oh, I see. Sorry, Sam. Sorry, Rudy.
Yeah, no worries. All right. So this is going to be very short. So I'm just going to go ahead and we'll just treat the Q&As as the break. So this is the third and last section of the webinar, which is focused on how to propose a Criterion C site using the WDKBA, and just ignore the background image, which is of the Excel file. So there are 2 major components of the KBA proposal for a Criterion C site. One is that you will have to write a report that illustrates how the site has intact ecological communities and low or no human impact. And then you'll need to email that report to the regional focal point. And then 2, in the WDKBA proposal portal, so here you can see a picture of it, you will need to summarize both of these characteristics in the relevant section of the WDKBA. As I've mentioned on the slide, the summaries will be included in the site fact sheet, which means that it can be read by anyone and everyone who has an internet connection. So please make sure that you write clearly and use simple language, because these summaries are not for the KBA Secretariat, they are for the general public. Also, I'm not going to go over the details of how to actually make your account in the WDKBA or how to register, because we already have a series that deals with getting started with KBAs, proposing KBAs, and the review process. So if you would like more information on how to actually register and create an account and get started with proposing KBAs, then let me know, and I will send you the YouTube video links to that, those YouTube videos. But in terms of components of the Criterion C report, so this is just an example slide to show you some of the key components of the report. We're not saying that your report has to have all of these titles, but it will need to include some of these elements. So for example, you will definitely need to provide the 3 and 4, so evidence of meeting intact ecological communities requirement and evidence of meeting low human impact requirements. But it would also be useful if you provided a concept map for the ecoregion, and also provided your a section where you describe your reasoning for selecting the key attributes and indicators that you did end up selecting for intact ecological communities and or to demonstrate intact ecological communities and low human impact. This could, the concept map and the reasoning for why you selected these indicators could go a long way in helping the regional focal points and the Secretariat understand the data availability and limitations and the thought process behind some of the key decisions made in the report. And once you've written the report in the WDKBA proposal portal itself, you will see a section that asks you for evidence for intact ecological communities. In this section, you will need to summarize your main points and then write it out in a paragraph or 2. Similarly, in the evidence for low human impact, you will need to summarize the evidence that shows little or no human impact at the site. And that is it for this session. Are there any questions at the end, or is everyone asleep? I'm going to turn on my video now.
Very clear. Thank you, Rudy.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Maybe one question on size. You say that 10,000 and above is recommended, which is clear. But I can imagine that there'll probably be quite a few sites around that are below that threshold, but which you can still demonstrate all the other requirements being met around composition, structure, function, around the presence of disturbance sensitive species and all that sort of thing. Is there any kind of examples of non-island, or you use the examples of mountains and islands and those kinds of things, which are like naturally smaller than that 10,000 kilometers squared. But what about places like really well managed protected areas that happen to be below that?
Sorry, I actually lost my internet connection there for a second, so I didn't hear that question. But Andy, if you were here, you probably heard it.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah, we're not going to sort of stick to the 10,000 square kilometers if you can demonstrate that there's a viable or a functioning population of all of your trophic levels. Then, and it's a smaller area, that's going to be fine. I mean, that's something like 22% of all ecoregions are smaller than 10,000 square kilometers. Okay. So
yeah, cool.
So some of those are going to have smaller areas if they're going to have Criterion C sites.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
And I see from the chat that Nicholas has a question as well. Does it mean that a site with roads inside cannot trigger the C criteria, even though the other criteria are met? So one of the key components is that you have to measure impact, not just the presence. So if the road is actually just connecting point A to point B, and it doesn't seem to have any other negative impact on the ecological integrity of the site, then yeah, I mean, the site can have a road that would be fine. Also, if when there are going to be cases where some Criterion C sites might include areas that do have indigenous communities within the area as well. If those areas have roads or other smaller signs of development, that is totally fine. It's more that the impact of human activities should not be negatively affecting the integrity of or the ecological integrity of the site. Does that answer your question? Okay, I'm assuming it does. Okay, and then Jeannot also had a question. Do you plan a technical session on this, how to use some software? Software in terms of how to use some of the, I forget what they're called. So far, we don't have any specific sessions planned on how to use software. Could you elaborate on what you mean by the software? What type of software are you talking about? Okay, I'm going to try to send him a message in case. Okay, so that potentially is something that we might follow up on later. Does anyone else have any other questions? I guess not. All right, in that case, I think that may be it. All right. Yeah, okay. Thank you all for attending this session. I did have a short activity planned, but I think we're over time, so we're probably not going to actually do it. But it basically was just in terms of creating or just listing out the indicators for a site of your interest. But yeah, we're going to skip it for this time. Have a good rest of the day.